Odell's hand closes around a stiff envelope at the bottom of a cardboard box, a school district seal pressed into the corner. And before he can set it back down, Ozella looks up from her own pile and sees exactly what he's holding. Her face doesn't move, but something behind it does. The date on that letter matches the same spring she vanished from his life. No goodbye, no forwarding address, nothing at all.
Put that down.
She crosses the kitchen in 3 steps to take it from his hands herself, folding it once, then again, until 22 years of silence disappears into her closed fist. He doesn't know yet what that letter says. He's about to find out exactly what it truly cost her to raise him. Subscribe right now. Tell me where you're listening from, because what she says next has been 22 years in the making. The vote was 90 seconds from closing when the television in Odell Ferris's Austin office cut away from the board's quarterly slide deck to a breaking segment out of Cleveland, and his hand stopped over the mute button before he understood why. A woman stood on a curb in the Huff neighborhood, her belongings stacked behind her in mismatched storage bins. She wasn't crying. She was arguing, calm and level, with a man holding a clipboard who wouldn't look at her directly. A neighbor stood off to the side, filming on a phone, close enough to help carry something and not moving to do it. The camera never quite caught her face. It wasn't the bins. It wasn't the clipboard. It wasn't the address the reporter read out loud. It was her voice. "I kept this floor for 31 years, she told the microphone. "You don't put a woman out on a Tuesday like she's trash day." Odell knew that cadence. He'd heard it aimed at a scared 11-year-old hiding behind a supply closet door. He knew the voice before the chyron caught up. Then it did. Ozella Tibbs. The boardroom kept talking. Someone asked him about the Denver acquisition. He didn't hear it. He was already moving. A junior board member reached over and tapped his arm, thinking he'd frozen on the vote, and Odell brushed past him without a word, already halfway to the door before anyone registered he'd left his own meeting mid-motion. No call to his assistant, no call to his lawyer, just the first seat to Cleveland Hopkins, booked standing in the hallway with the vote still going on behind him. 22 years of silence answered in the time it took to book a flight. By the time the plane leveled off, he still hadn't called anyone. He kept his laptop closed and ran the math backward. 22 years, give or take a Christmas card that had come back twice marked return to sender before he'd stopped sending them. A 15-year-old boy had once walked into an empty custodian's closet and found someone else's cart, someone else's name tag, no explanation waiting for him anywhere in the building. He'd told himself for 2 decades that she'd simply moved on. He was about to find out that was a story he'd made up to let himself off the hook. He didn't know what he was going to say to her, or if she'd even let him say it. Subscribe now. This is about to get so much worse. Somewhere over Kentucky, the seatbelt sign clicked off, and Odell didn't move. He'd never once lost his composure in a boardroom. He thought about the coat she'd left in the janitor's closet for him, sized 2 years ahead, and realized he couldn't remember what had happened to it, whether he'd outgrown it, lost it, left it behind in a move he no longer remembered making. The pilot's voice crackled through the cabin, announcing the descent into Cleveland, and Odell watched the seatbelt light blink back on without moving to fasten his own. He had no idea how to face Ozella Tibbs and explain 22 years of silence. The plane began its descent before he found a sentence that felt like enough. And somewhere down there, a woman he owed everything to was still standing on a curb, with nowhere to put the last of what she owned, waiting, without knowing it, to unravel everything Odell believed about the debt he thought he'd already paid. 20 minutes to landing, and Odell still didn't have a plan. Somewhere below the wing, Cleveland was turning into a grid of streetlights, and his mind kept snapping back to a cafeteria that had been demolished a decade ago. He was 9, sitting alone at a folding table with a tray nobody had cleared, when the mop bucket squeaked into the doorway. 6 o'clock. Everyone else had been picked up hours ago. Ozella never asked why nobody was coming for him. She just set a second sandwich down next to his empty tray, wrapped in the same wax paper as her own, and told him to eat it before it went to waste. A flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin, asking everyone to stow their trays for descent, and Odell realized he'd been holding his own untouched coffee at the same angle for the last 10 minutes. That became the arrangement, unspoken and never renegotiated. A coat that showed up in the janitor's closet the week the temperature dropped, size 2 years ahead of him because she'd already clocked how fast he was growing. A stack of library discard electronics manuals pulled off the recycling cart, left where he'd find them. She taught him to strip a wire before anyone taught him to tie a proper knot in his shoelaces. By 14, he could rebuild a motor from parts she'd smuggled out of the district's junk pile in a 5-gallon bucket, and neither of them ever called it what it was. The wheels touched pavement hard enough to jolt him out of it. Real time again. Seatbelt sign-off. A cabin full of strangers already reaching for overhead bins, none of them carrying 22 years of anything. Nobody at Chesterfield Elementary asked why the night custodian kept a boy who didn't belong to her, fed, clothed, and half-raised in the hours between the last bell and whenever his aunt's house, or the group home on East 105th, finally had room for him, because nobody was paying attention in the first place. His aunt worked doubles at a distribution warehouse off I-90, and couldn't always get free in time for pickup, and the group home ran on a waiting list that didn't care whether a 9-year-old had eaten dinner. Ozella never once made him explain which situation he was caught between on any given week. She just kept the second sandwich ready either way. Then the spring he turned 15, it stopped. No goodbye. No note in the closet. A different custodian pushing a different cart. Uninterested in broken projectors or boys who lingered too long after the last bell. Odell asked the front office where Miss Ozella had gone, and got a shrug and a name he didn't recognize on a new employee badge. He told himself she'd retired, found something better than mopping floors for a school that never paid her enough. He was 17 when he aged out of the system with an engineering scholarship and no address to send the acceptance letter to, and he let that be the end of the story, because chasing the real answer would have meant admitting he'd let the only person who ever came looking for him disappear without once looking back. Odell had the rental car keys in his hand before the seatbelt sign finished its chime. One address, pulled from an old district record his assistant had dug up on 4 hours' notice. A duplex on East 79th, filed under Ozella Tibbs 3 years ago and never updated since. 3 years was enough time for a person to move twice, for a landlord to change, for a phone number to disconnect. Odell sat in the rental car in the airport lot with the engine running and the address glowing on his phone screen, and for the first time since the boardroom television had cut to Cleveland, it occurred to him that he might drive to that duplex and find a stranger standing in the doorway, that he might have flown 2 states to arrive 22 years too late for the second time. The duplex on East 79th had a padlock on the door and a stranger's name on the mailbox. Odell stood on the porch for exactly 4 seconds before he turned around and started walking, because a padlock told him everything the address couldn't. 3 years old meant nothing. She'd been here recently enough that the eviction crew still knew which unit to clear. He found her 3 blocks away, outside a shuttered barber shop, sitting on an overturned plastic crate with one hand resting flat on top of the nearest garbage bag, not gripping it, just resting there. She looked up before he said a word. "You lost, or you looking for a story?" "Ozella." She went still. She studied his face for a long beat, checking it against the boy she remembered. Then she said his name back, quiet, like she was testing whether the word still fit in her mouth after 22 years of not using it. Odell Ferris. She said it flat, no question mark on the end. "Look at you." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and the silence sat between them until a gust off the lake pushed a plastic bag across the sidewalk, and neither of them moved to catch it. "Rain's coming," Ozella said. "You gonna stand there in a suit that costs more than my rent did? Or you gonna help me get these bags somewhere dry?" He helped. He carried 2 bags at a time, then 3, following half a step behind her, down a block she clearly knew better than he knew any street in Austin. She didn't thank him, didn't explain where they were going. She just kept walking, and he kept following, the same way he had at 9 years old. Ozella setting the terms, Odell falling into step, neither of them discussing it out loud. A man on a porch 2 doors down called out her name, and she raised a hand without breaking stride, not stopping to explain the suit walking behind her either. They made it to a cousin's basement, 2 streets over, before the rain actually hit. A woman about Ozella's age came down the stairs, took one look at Odell in his suit, and looked at Ozella instead. "This the one you used to talk about?" "This is nobody," Ozella said, not unkindly, and the cousin went back upstairs without another word. Odell said nothing. He'd already learned not to argue with how Ozella Tibbs decided to introduce him, and he filed the question away, because used to talk about was the first crack of proof that he'd crossed her mind at all in 22 years. "Why'd you leave the school?" Odell asked, because he'd been holding the question for 3 blocks and couldn't hold it any longer. Ozella's face didn't change. "That's not a today conversation." "Ozella," I said, "it's not a today conversation. Flat, final, no room built into it for a follow-up. You want to carry bags, carry bags. You want to ask me why a woman disappeared 22 years ago? You can wait until I decide you've earned the answer. Subscribe now. You don't want to miss what she finally tells him." Odell set down the bag he was holding slower than he needed to, buying himself a second to decide whether to push. He didn't. 22 years of silence had taught him exactly one thing about Ozella Tibbs. She didn't move on anyone's schedule but her own, and trying to force the door only got it slammed harder. So he let it sit. "Fine," he said. "Fine," she repeated, and her shoulders eased half an inch. She didn't ask why he'd flown in from Austin the same night the story broke, or how he'd found her 3 blocks from a padlocked door. Whatever she'd decided about why he was standing in a stranger's basement carrying her garbage bags, she wasn't saying, the same way she hadn't said anything about the last 22 years. Odell watched her stack the bags against the wall in careful, deliberate rows, and understood. Whatever had actually happened to her after she left Chesterfield Elementary was buried on purpose, and she wasn't handing him the shovel until she decided he'd earned it. Odell came back the next morning with coffee, and no plan beyond showing up. Ozella let him in without comment, which he'd learned by now counted as an invitation. She was sorting through a box of old paperwork on the cousin's kitchen table, and she handed him a stack of it without being asked. "Sort the bills from the rest," she said. "Anything past due goes in its own pile." He sorted. Somewhere in the second hour, without her narrating it as a story, pieces started surfacing on their own. A pay stub from a custodial contractor called Bright Path Facilities, dated 4 years back, listing an hourly rate lower than what she'd been making when Odell was still in high school. Behind it, a termination notice from a different contractor, no reason given beyond position eliminated. Behind that, another pay stub from a third company, the rate lower again. "You worked for all these?" Odell asked, holding up 3 different company letterheads. "Contracts end," Ozella said, not looking up from her own pile. "New ones pay less. That's how it goes when you're 61 and nobody wants to train somebody new." He came back the second day with the same coffee and the same lack of a plan, and the pieces kept surfacing sideways, one document at a time, none of them handed to him as a confession. A shut-off notice from the gas company, paid 2 days late with a fee attached, a pawn slip for a television sold 8 months ago, a food pantry flyer from St. Clair, creased soft from being carried in a coat pocket. "This wasn't one bad month," Odell said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. Odella didn't answer right away. She kept sorting, and when she did answer, she didn't look at him. No, it wasn't. That was all she gave him. Odell wanted to ask what it was. How far back? How many jobs? How many months? She'd been one missed shift from exactly what he'd watched happen on a television screen in Austin. But he'd learned 3 blocks and 2 days ago that pushing only closed the door faster. "You could have called me," he said instead, quieter. "Any point in 22 years. Called you with what phone, Odell?" She didn't look up. "And said what? Come save me? I've been saving myself since before you could tie your own shoes. Wasn't about to start needing rescue now. That's not what I meant." "I know exactly what you meant." She finally stopped sorting long enough to look at him. You meant if you'd known, you would have fixed it. And maybe you would have. But knowing costs something too, Odell. I wasn't ready to hand you that bill 22 years ago, and some days I'm still not sure I am now. So he kept sorting, and somewhere near the bottom of the box, his hand closed around an envelope stiffer than the rest. Official letterhead, a school district seal in the corner. He read the first line before he understood what he was holding. Termination of employment. Cause. Policy violation. Unauthorized occupancy. The date at the top was the same spring he'd turned 15, the same spring the mop bucket had gone quiet, and a stranger had taken over Ozella's cart without explanation. Ozella looked up from her pile at exactly the wrong moment, and she saw what he was holding before he had time to set it down. Her face didn't change, but something behind it did, a stillness that went a layer deeper than the stillness she usually kept. "Put that down," she said. Odell didn't move. "Ozella, this is dated the same year you left." She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took the letter out of his hands herself, folding it once, then again, until it disappeared into her palm. She didn't answer his question, and she didn't deny it either. She just stood there holding 22 years of silence in one folded piece of paper, and for the first time since he'd found her outside that barber shop, Odell understood that whatever she was about to tell him was going to change every version of the story he'd told himself since he was 15. Ozella didn't sit down. She stood at the kitchen counter with the folded letter still in her fist, and she stared at the wall for long enough that Odell thought she might not answer him at all. "You were 15, she said finally. "Your placement fell through in February. Group home said they didn't have a bed for you until March. You know where you slept those 3 weeks?" Odell shook his head slowly, though some part of him already suspected. "Storage room off the gym. Cot I brought in myself, piece by piece, so nobody'd see me carrying a whole bed through the halls at once. I fed you out of my own check. I signed you in as staying late for tutoring so the night guard wouldn't ask questions." She set the letter down on the counter and smoothed it flat with one hand. "District found out in April. Somebody saw the cot, called it an unauthorized occupant, a liability, a policy violation. 31 years on that floor, and they let me go over a phone call that took 4 minutes." "No hearing," Odell said, reading it off the letter without meaning to. "No hearing, no pension credit for that last year, no reference for the next job, because you can't put down terminated for cause and expect anybody to call you back." She finally looked at him. "You want to know why I never sent a forwarding address? Because explaining it meant telling a 15-year-old boy that keeping him fed cost me the only stable job I ever had. You think you could have carried that at 15? I wasn't about to hand you a debt you didn't ask for." Odell's throat closed around whatever he'd meant to say. 22 years he'd told himself a story where Ozella simply moved on, found something better, chose to let a grown man build his own life without her attached to it. He'd built an entire understanding of his own guilt on that story. Mild guilt, manageable guilt, the kind he could set down and never open again. "Why didn't you fight it?" Odell finally managed. "A hearing, a union rep, something." Custodial staff weren't union at that district, never had been, and fighting it meant a lawyer, and a lawyer meant money I didn't have, and money I didn't have meant 1 more month I couldn't feed you. Ozella shook her head once, like the question itself was a small mercy she didn't have room for. "Some fights you don't win. You just decide which ones are worth losing quietly." "You didn't leave," he said. "You were erased, for keeping me." Her hand tightened around the folded letter, just once, knuckles going pale for a second before she loosened her grip again. It was the only thing about her that had moved since she started talking. "That's exactly what happened." Ozella's voice didn't rise. It never rose. "And I carried it alone for 22 years, because the alternative was watching you carry it instead. And I'd already decided a long time before that morning that I wasn't going to let anything land on you that I could take myself. If this gut punch hit you too, hit subscribe before the next one lands." Odell sat down at the kitchen table because his legs had stopped feeling entirely trustworthy. 22 years of a Christmas card, returned twice, of telling himself he hadn't chased hard enough because there hadn't been anything left to chase. All of it built on a lie he'd told himself so he wouldn't have to sit with the real shape of what happened. A 61-year-old woman who lost the only steady floor she'd ever kept because she chose a stranger's kid over her own paycheck, and never once said a word about it to the one person who owed her everything. Ozella pulled out the chair across from him and sat down for the first time since he'd walked in, sliding an untouched mug of coffee toward him that she must have poured before he ever arrived. For a moment, neither of them said anything. She just watched him hold the mug without drinking from it. Ozella. His voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. I looked for you. For maybe a year. Then I stopped. I know you stopped. She said it without cruelty, just fact. I made sure you couldn't find me. New apartment, no forwarding address, unlisted number the one time I could afford a phone. I did that on purpose. Odell, not because I didn't want you, because I didn't want you finding out what it cost. Odell looked down at the letter still sitting on the counter between them. 4 sentences of district language that had quietly rerouted the rest of a woman's life, and felt everything he'd believed about himself. The drifting, the losing touch, the gentle tragedy of 2 people who simply grew apart, give way to something far heavier and far more deliberate. He hadn't lost her. She'd been made to disappear, on purpose, for the crime of keeping a boy alive when nobody else was looking. And the debt he'd spent 22 years quietly pretending didn't exist had just revealed itself to be twice the size he'd ever let himself imagine. Odell waited until morning to bring it up. He waited until she'd made coffee for real this time, until the cousin had left for a shift somewhere, until it felt like there was room in the kitchen for a different kind of conversation. I want to buy you a place, he said. Somewhere with your name on the lease. No landlord who can pull it out from under you. Ozella didn't look up from her cup. No. Ozella? I said no. She set the cup down harder than she needed to. You think a check fixes 31 years? You think a new address makes up for a district letting me go over a phone call and nobody ever saying sorry for it? I'm not trying to buy an apology. I'm trying to make sure you're never standing on a curb again. That's exactly what a check does, Odell. It handles the outcome and skips the truth. She finally looked at him. I don't need saving. I raised myself out of worse than this before you ever knew my name. What I needed was for somebody, one time, to say what happened to me was wrong. You want to help? You can start there. Odell sat with that longer than he wanted to. He'd spent 2 decades solving problems by writing checks, and it had never once occurred to him that the woman who taught him to strip a wire before he could tie his shoes might not want the version of help that came easiest to him. Through the wall, he could hear the cousin moving pans around in the kitchen, pretending not to listen. Ozella noticed him notice, and didn't acknowledge it either. Some things in this house, apparently, everyone agreed not to comment on. Okay, he said. Then tell me what actually happened. Not the letter, the rest of it. She told him pieces over the next hour. The string of contractors, the wages sliding lower each time, the eviction that hadn't been one bad month, but the last domino in 20 years of never quite catching up. She told it flat, without asking for anything, like the facts alone were supposed to be enough. When she got to the part about the notice taped to her door, she didn't slow down or soften it. 3 days. That's all the law requires here. 3 days to find somewhere else to put your whole life. It was the eviction itself that snagged in Odell's mind. Not the how. He understood how eviction worked. It was the who. Somebody had signed off on putting a 61-year-old woman on a curb over a missed payment, and Odell wanted a name he could put pressure on. He called his office that afternoon, stepping out onto the cousin's front porch, so Ozella wouldn't hear him doing the one thing he knew how to do. Pull the property records on the East 79th building, he told his assistant. Whoever owns it, I want a name by tonight. The name came back a little after 6, and it wasn't a name at all. It was a chain. The building's deed traced to a management company, which traced to a holding entity registered in Delaware, which traced to a second holding entity that existed only on paper, filed by a law firm that specialized in exactly that kind of filing. Odell had built 2 companies. He knew what a chain like that meant. Somebody wanted distance between themselves and whatever happened at street level, and the more links in the chain, the more they had to hide. His assistant kept working through the evening, peeling back one shell after another, and around 9, she sent a single line that made Odell go still on the porch steps, in a way the district's termination letter hadn't managed to do. Final entity in the chain, Redbud Capital. Odell read the name twice. It sat somewhere in the back of his memory. Not a stranger's name, not the faceless landlord he'd expected to find and out-negotiate by morning. Closer than that. He'd heard it somewhere, in a quarterly report or a fund summary, one of a dozen documents his office sent him every year that he skimmed and initialed without reading past the first page. He didn't know yet what Redbud Capital was to him. He only knew, standing alone on a stranger's porch with his phone glowing in the dark, that the name shouldn't have felt this close at all, and that some part of him already understood he wasn't going to like the answer once he found it. Odell didn't sleep. He sat at the cousin's kitchen table with his laptop open and the house quiet around him, pulling every document his office could legally access on Redbud Capital, and somewhere past midnight, the pieces started lining up. Redbud wasn't a landlord. It was a debt servicing fund, the kind of entity that bought distressed rent rolls from property owners who wanted eviction filings handled fast and clean, then charged a servicing fee for every unit it cleared off the books. It didn't manage buildings. It processed them. Tenants weren't customers to a fund like that. They were line items standing between Redbud and its fee. He still didn't recognize the name outright, not at first. He scrolled through fund documentation one connection at a time, refusing to guess ahead of the wire. Redbud Capital, debt servicing, formed 11 years ago, headquartered in a Charlotte office park that existed mostly on paper. Nothing about it rang a bell until he opened his own family office's portfolio summary from 2 years back, the one his team sent every quarter, and he initialed without reading past the cover page. There it was, $3 million, routed into Redbud as part of a diversified income allocation, buried in a document he'd approved in under a minute between 2 board calls. Odell sat back from the laptop and didn't move for a long moment. He'd signed off on it. Not knowingly, he hadn't picked Redbud, hadn't researched it, hadn't so much as read the fund's name before his signature went on the page. But the money was his, the account was his. Every dollar Redbud used to buy distressed rent rolls and push eviction filings through the fastest legal timeline available had, in some small percentage, come out of an allocation he'd approved without looking. He thought about every quarterly summary he'd ever initialed in under a minute, every fund name he'd never once looked up, and wondered how many other Redbuds were sitting in that same portfolio, doing the same quiet work under a different name. He kept pulling threads anyway, because stopping now felt like a different kind of cowardice. Redbud's servicing contracts flagged properties for what the fund's internal paperwork called expedited turnover, a phrase that meant nothing on its face and everything underneath it. Elderly tenants, single-income households, anyone whose payment history showed even one missed month, fast-tracked through eviction before they had time to catch up. One file caught him mid-scroll, a widow in a building on Kinsman Road, 4 months behind after a hospital stay, flagged for turnover the same week her insurance denied the claim. Redbud's notes on the file didn't mention the hospital stay. They mentioned the fee schedule for clearing the unit. Odell built a spreadsheet at 2 a.m, cross-referencing every property Redbud had processed that quarter against the eviction filings tied to each address. 41 buildings, 41 sets of tenants pushed through the same fast-tracked machine, all flagged the same way, all cleared inside the same narrow legal window Redbud's contracts allowed. He found East 79th on line 17. Subscribe now. His own money just implicated him. The filing date matched the broadcast almost to the day, and the tenant name matched the letter still folded somewhere in Ozella's coat pocket. His own money, sitting untouched in a spreadsheet he'd never bothered to open, had been part of the machine that put her on that curb before he'd ever seen her face on a television screen in Austin. He hadn't just failed to help her in time. He'd been paying, on a quiet monthly basis, for the system that broke her. Odell closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, the house silent, except for the cousin's refrigerator, humming somewhere down the hall. He thought about Ozella asleep 2 rooms away, still believing the worst thing Odell had done was disappear from her life for 22 years, not knowing yet that the truth was worse than absence, that the boy she'd raised had, without ever meaning to, become one more name on the list of people who'd profited from putting her out. He had the truth sitting open on a spreadsheet in front of him, and no idea yet how to say it out loud to the one person who'd already told him, twice now, that she didn't want to check. She wanted the truth acknowledged. This was the truth. It just happened to be the kind that made him the villain of the very story he'd flown in to fix. Odell asked her to meet him at a diner on St. Clair Avenue, because a kitchen table felt too small for what he had to say, and anywhere with his name on the reservation felt too big. She showed up in the same coat she'd been wearing since the curb, and she slid into the booth across from him without asking why he'd called it a diner conversation instead of another basement one. 2 coffees arrived. Neither of them touched theirs. "I need to tell you something," Odell said. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Ozella folded her hands on the table and waited. A waitress came by to refill coffee neither of them had touched, and read the table fast enough to leave without a word. "The building on East 79th, the one they put you out of." Odell's voice didn't shake, but it came close. "It traces back through a chain of holding companies to a fund called Redbud Capital. Redbud buys distressed rent rolls and pushes evictions through the fastest legal window it can find. 2 years ago, before any of this happened, my family office put $3 million into that fund as part of a routine portfolio move. I never read the paperwork. I never asked what they did with it. He made himself say the rest in one breath, because if he stopped, he wasn't sure he'd start again. My money helped build the machine that evicted you. I didn't just fail to help you in time, I was already paying for what happened to you before I ever saw your face on that television screen." Ozella didn't move. She didn't gasp, didn't push back from the table, didn't do any of the things Odell had braced himself for on the drive over. She just sat there, hands still folded, and the quiet that settled over her was the same quiet from the district office 22 years ago. Not empty, but loaded. "Say something," Odell said, because the silence had gone on long enough to feel like its own kind of verdict. "I fed you with my own check," Ozella said finally, low and even. "Snuck you into a storage room, lost a pension over it, and the very money I put into a growing boy is the same money that grew up and put me on a curb." She looked at him without blinking. "That's not a coincidence, Odell. That's a circle closing. I'm going to fix it. Every building, every—" "I know you are," she said it flatly, not as comfort. "That's not the part I'm sitting with right now. Then tell me what is." Ozella was quiet again, longer this time, and when she spoke, her voice had gone somewhere Odell hadn't heard it go before. Not angry, not wounded, just tired in a way that reached back further than the last 2 weeks. "I spent 31 years making sure kids in that building had somebody who noticed when they went missing. I lost my job for it. I lost my pension for it. And this whole time, while I was cycling through contracts that paid less every year, somewhere in a spreadsheet you never opened, my own boy's money was quietly finishing the job the district started. You didn't do it on purpose, I know that. But knowing that doesn't make it feel any less like the same hand, twice." She stood up before he could answer. She didn't slam anything, didn't raise her voice, didn't give the diner a single reason to look over. She reached into her coat, set $2 on the table for her untouched coffee, because she'd never once let anyone else pay for something she hadn't finished, and walked out into the cold without looking back at the booth. Odell sat there for a long time after the door closed behind her. He didn't chase her down the sidewalk, didn't call. Some part of him understood, watching her cross St. Clair through the diner's front window, that running after her right now would only prove her point, that he still thought a grand gesture could out-negotiate the truth. 3 days passed. She didn't answer his calls. He didn't send flowers or a check or an apology dressed up as either. Instead, on the second night, he opened his laptop at the cousin's kitchen table and started pulling Redbud's full portfolio, all 41 properties, cross-referencing every eviction filing against tenant payment histories, patient and methodical, refusing to skip a single line. He told himself it was progress. It didn't feel like progress. It felt like sitting alone in a borrowed kitchen at 2 a.m, doing the only thing he knew how to do. He had no idea if it would ever be enough to undo the sound of a diner chair scraping back. No idea if it could undo a door closing behind a woman who hadn't looked at him once on her way out. For the first time since he was 15 years old, standing in an empty custodian's closet, asking why nobody would tell him where she'd gone, Odell understood exactly what he owed her, and understanding it didn't bring her any closer to forgiving him. If anything, the distance between them had never felt wider than it did right now, on the third night, with her silence the only answer he had. Odell didn't call a lawyer first. He called the one person at his family office he trusted not to ask why, and he told her to freeze every servicing contract Redbud Capital held, effective immediately, no exceptions, and no explanation owed to anyone on the other end of the phone. It took 4 days to force the full buyout. Redbud's partners fought hard. $3 million of committed capital doesn't disappear quietly. A managing partner named Trent Calloway called his cell at 11 at night, trying to talk him down to a partial sale. "We're not the villain here, Odell. We service debt other funds won't touch. Somebody's got to clear these units, or the whole portfolio drags the rest of the fund down with it." "You froze a widow's file the same week her insurance denied a claim," Odell said. "Read me the part where that's not you." Calloway didn't have an answer ready for that. Odell let the silence sit exactly as long as Ozella would have, then said no to the partial sale, and hung up before the man could try again. He bought Redbud's entire servicing book outright and dissolved the fund's authority over every property it touched, 41 buildings in one motion. Then came the part nobody at his office understood, the part with no return on it that any spreadsheet could show. Odell personally underwrote reinstatement for every tenant still inside an appeal window. Back rent cleared, eviction flags stripped from every record, locks changed, heat fixed before winter finished settling in. Ozella's unit on East 79th went first. A locksmith called his assistant directly to confirm the address twice, because in 11 years of doing eviction reversal work for other clients, he'd never once had a job that ran in this direction. He didn't put his name on the paperwork, didn't call a reporter, didn't issue a statement, didn't let his office frame it as anything other than a routine portfolio correction, because the last thing he wanted was a headline standing between him and the one person who needed to know it was real. He audited Redbud's history, one connection at a time, refusing to guess which wire carried the fault, tracing every file back to the source and testing it before moving to the next. Elderly tenants, single-income households, every file flagged for expedited turnover going back 3 years. He found the pattern repeated in 2 other cities before he was done, Memphis and Birmingham, both running the same fast-tracked machine under different fund names. He froze those too, and let the whole thing move through his office as a routine portfolio restructuring, 11 words in a press summary that erased 41 families from the story entirely, exactly the way he wanted it. Subscribe now. This is what facing the truth actually costs. None of it brought her back to the phone. She still didn't answer his calls, and he stopped expecting her to, because he understood now that fixing the buildings wasn't the same as fixing what his money had done to her specifically, and no amount of 41 building corrections was going to substitute for showing up in person and letting her decide, on her own time, whether any of it meant anything. So he drove back to the corner outside the shuttered barber shop, the same overturned crate still sitting there, and he sat down on it and waited. 2 hours passed before she came around the block, moving slower than she had the day he found her, a grocery bag in one hand. She stopped 10 feet away and looked at him sitting on her old crate. "You didn't have to do all that," she said. "It wasn't quite forgiveness. It wasn't quite anything yet." "I know," Odell said. "I did it anyway." Ozella set the grocery bag down and studied him for a long moment. The same slow assessment she'd run on him the first day. Then she said something that had nothing to do with the buildings, nothing to do with Redbud, nothing to do with any of the 4 days he'd spent burning down a fund to prove a point she hadn't asked him to prove. "There's a boy 2 doors down from where I'm staying now. 15, maybe 16. His placement fell through same as yours did once, and his caseworkers got him sleeping in the laundry room behind the building because nobody's got anywhere else to put him." She looked at Odell steady, no softness in it, just fact laid down flat. "I'm not asking you to fix that with a spreadsheet." Odell stood up off the crate. Whatever he'd driven here expecting. Forgiveness. A door cracked open. Some acknowledgement that the last 4 days had counted for something. This wasn't it. And some part of him understood immediately that it didn't need to be. The debt he owed Ozella Tibbs had never been the kind a man closed out with a single grand correction. It kept finding new addresses to land on. And the only real answer he had was the one Ozella had given a boy in a cafeteria nearly 3 decades ago, before either of them had a name for what it cost her. "Where's the laundry room?" he said, and got in the car. Corwin Ashby was already halfway packed into a backpack when Odell found him behind the laundry room's folding table, everything he owned, zipped up and ready to move at a moment's notice. The same instinct any kid learns after enough placements fall through. Odell didn't offer money or a speech about second chances. He crouched down to the boy's eye level and said the only thing that had ever actually worked on him at that age. "You hungry?" Corwin didn't answer right away, which Odell understood now was its own kind of answer. The caseworker's paperwork on Corwin's placement had a gap in it. 3 days before the next facility could take him, 3 days with nowhere assigned, and for a moment it looked like the same crack Ozella had once tried to catch a boy from falling through. Let's Dades be Sella. Subscribe now. Watch how fast he closes that gap. Odell made 2 calls before dinner, and by the time the sun went down, Corwin had a cot in the same building where Ozella now kept her own key, filed clean through the front office, instead of hidden behind a mop cart. No storage room. No secret. Nobody's job on the line for it this time. The following week, Ozella went back to work, not because she needed the money, but because sitting still had never once suited her. She took a part-time custodial contract at a rec center 2 blocks from her building, and this time, her name went on the lease and the schedule both, with a key nobody could take back over a phone call that lasted 4 minutes. She kept a second sandwich in her cart on the first day, out of habit more than plan, and didn't need it, and brought it home anyway rather than throw it out. Corwin started coming by after school, and Ozella put a busted circuit board in front of him the same week, without a single lecture attached to it. Odell brought parts sometimes. Resistors, a soldering iron, wire he didn't ask questions about, and let Ozella decide what to do with all of it, because some things a man learns not to take credit for. Odell let it stay small. He wasn't interested in being praised for finally noticing what he should have caught 2 years earlier, and the internal memo his own team wrote about it never made it past 3 people. He'd learned, the hard way, that the version of help worth doing rarely came with a headline attached, and that the only audience that actually mattered was 2 blocks away, learning to hold a soldering iron steady. Odell started showing up on Sundays, not to check on an investment, not to manage an outcome, just to sit in a kitchen that smelled like solder and coffee and watch a 15-year-old fumble a soldering iron under Ozella's sharp instruction. She corrected Corwin's grip the same way she'd once corrected Odell's. No praise for getting it right, just a flat, again, until it stopped being luck. She still hadn't said the word forgiveness out loud. She hadn't handed him a receipt for what he owed her, and some part of Odell understood she never fully would. That the debt didn't work that way, that showing up was the payment, not a down payment towards something bigger coming later. One Sunday in December, with snow collecting on the rec center's windowsill, and Corwin cursing quietly at a wire that wouldn't hold its solder, Ozella looked over at Odell without quite meaning to, and said the boy reminded her of somebody. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Odell understood the unfinished half of it. The sandwich she never called charity. the coat she never called love, the 22 years of silence she never called a sacrifice. Some debts don't get paid off in a single transaction, a single buyout, a single confession over untouched coffee. They get paid off one Sunday at a time. Odell had shown up for this one, and he was going to keep showing up for it. And that, not the buildings, not the money, not anything he could sign his name to, was the only kind of payment Ozella Tibbs had ever actually wanted from him.